In 1977, Dr. Cry from Sioux Center had gone to Alaska and hunted Dall sheep, and Hank and I had always talked about going there someday. And this Dr. Cry had gotten the 17th largest Dall sheep ever taken in Alaska, so we thought, hey, this is the time to go. Because the areas in Alaska are allotted to individuals to farm. They can either take a lot of hunters or a few hunters. This guy had taken few hunters over the years. Consequently, there were some good trophies in that area. So we decided to book a hunt with Danny Watley, the young fella who flew us in and out, and the outfitter. And he said another reason that Dr. Cry was interested or encouraging us was that he had a young dairy farmer from Pennsylvania, Ernie Coleman, who was a guide, and he could get around. And so we decided we better quick book a hunt and do that in that area. So then it became how we're going to go, and we decided to take the motor home with our family, and Hank was going to take his wife and Rhonda and follow us in their pickup. So when we talked about this, my mother expressed an interest that she loved to travel. We knew she did, and we invited her along, and sure enough, we had to back up how many days from when the hunt was to Chris was in a 4-H project at Sioux Center, and we needed to get it shown, and then we had to hustle and get down there how many days to take to get to Alaska and how we were going to do it. So we had the show of her lead calf, and we couldn't stick around the next day for the sale because we would have had to get it on the road in order to make it to our destination. And of course, the next day we left early in the morning and drove to Rapid City and stayed by my brother George and Dorothy at their condo. And the next night we were on to Wyoming, and the country kept getting rougher and more beautiful. We had never driven out that way before, and the girls really enjoyed it. And anyway, the country was getting more beautiful as we went. We went to Yellowstone National Park and camped there overnight and had breakfast the next morning and had to take a few pictures, and continued on into the park and through the grandeur of it, and seen Old Faithful the next morning and all the other glory pools, etc. that at that time of the year there wasn't a lot of people yet. So the Morning Glory Blue Star Pool and the springs, and another group picture of the guys that were going to go. So we up to Crater Lake and through Yellowstone, up through Glacier National Park, and on into Alberta, into the wheat country there. Lots of big country, and stopped at Fort McClellan on the way. And time out here, what's going on? Headed up into the Canadian Rockies, and on our way up through to Banff National Park. Beauty of the country around there was getting more severe, and we started seeing some snow in the mountains, and this was mid-August. And of course we ran across a stone sheep along the road. Of course, a young one, and the girls had to get out and feed them some cookies and do their thing, and headed on up and into the park itself and through the grandeur of the country there, and seen our first ice fields, glaciers, on up into the park itself, the headquarters there, and you could tour out over Glacier National Park. So we were on a roll, headed through that country, and of course our ultimate goal was to head out of there and get down to Prince Rupert on the coast and get the welcome to British Columbia, and down to Prince Rupert along the Sitka River there, headed down to Prince Rupert and Athabasca Falls. And the girls seen there were a lot of berries along the road, so we had to stop and pick it. And coincidentally, the girls had laid out a whole menu of all the food that we were eating, and They had canned meat and vegetables and everything, dried stuff, and the only thing we bought was milk and bread. And we camped wherever we could find a campground at night and head on down to Prince Rupert and along the river, Sitka River there, headed down to Prince Rupert where we were going to disembark on the Inside Passage. We camped there that night, and of course we were in training. We were going to go sheep hunting, so we had to go out and jog around and stay in shape, so that we had been carrying our backpacks and wearing our heavy boots, so that it wasn't a real chore when we got to sheep hunting country, because you do a lot of backpacking in rough country up there. So the next morning we got up early and had to head down to get onto the Taku. I think the people there thought we were a little strange hiking around with heavy boots on and bareback, but we had to get ready to get on the Taku the next day. We were the last units on there, loaded on the back, and it was pretty tight fit so that the stuff that got on there first could get off at the next port. So we did not rent a stateroom. We had big lounge chairs and that we stayed in. And of course we were taken by the Inside Passage. We stopped at the ports of Wrangell and Ketchikan and Juneau and all up through there. We did have a beautiful breakfast the next morning. People were kind of wondering about whale watching, sitting on the deck on the outside and getting a little lonesome for home, I think, but we were always on the lookout for whales and what was going on. We did see some, but they were off in a distance, and we got to the port of Ketchikan, where they offloaded the vehicles that got on first, and the next day we got up and we were at Dyea, which is just outside of Skagway, where the miners carried all their stuff over the passes, and Irma was looking around at the old graveyards, and the next morning we were to get our vehicles tied on the flat car, because at that time there was no road out of Skagway. You had to take the Inside Passage, the railroad, and up over the top. They chained our vehicles on flatbeds, and we rode in a Pullman car in the back up through that area where the miners had carried all their stuff. And there's some of the hazards of building in Alaska. Was Caterpillar all crunched up, and up along that trail we were pulled by 3 big locomotives and headed up to Whitehorse, Yukon. Of course, we were getting up towards the flats up there and lots of wildflowers, but we sat in a Pullman car where you could look out one side. Of course, I never figured on the diesel smoke. And up in the middle of the flats up there, we had to stop the train so Irma could get her medication out of our motorhome, which was locked on a flatbed. And we crossed over from Canada back into Yukon and up on the top of the mountains there and headed towards Bennett Lake, which is the start of the Yukon River, where the miners all gathered, and they'd built a church there at some point, and they floated all their gear on rafts and boats down to Dawson. Of course, on the train there, we had a nice meal at Bennett Lake, supplied that. It was supplied to us, and we'd sit in the Pullman car, everybody looking out one way because there was just sheer mountain on the other side. Headed down towards Dawson. This time we took a little precaution with the diesel smoke, and Irma got by pretty good. So we got at Dawson and or at Whitehorse, and they had to offload the vehicles there and put them on. We got back on the road, went to inspect the falls there where they had a salmon fish ladder built around it, and went down the road to Cripple Creek and seen the beautiful flowers area there. And this is a 3-story skyscraper log house. We were headed down, we went around and up to Denali National Park and camped at one of the campgrounds there, and we had to go hiking. We had to stay in shape. And at first we had gone to Wander Lake at the end of the trail, where as close as you could get to Denali on one of their tour buses, and we seen Mount McKinley off in the distance and the wild little creatures there where we were having lunch. We fed them some cookies and crackers, etc. And we stayed that night at Riley Creek Campground, and we thought, well, we needed to go for a hike, we needed to stay in shape anyway, and the girls wanted to go along, so we crossed a glacier stream there of ice water coming off the underway from the glaciers up in the park. And as we were hiking along, I went over a ridge and I seen a Dall sheep laying there bedded down. I thought, I wonder how close I can actually get to this Dall sheep. So I was real careful, got down, kept taking pictures because I thought he'd take off running, kept getting closer, and look at the sheer drop off he's on, and he wasn't too worried about me. He said, kept taking pictures, and come around the deal there, and I was about 4 feet from him when he turned around and walked away from me up the hill. Of course, then we had to get over the hill back to Riley Creek Campground again, and the rangers gave a whole spiel about the ecology of the area, and the girls were kidding, they wanted to camp out, but after seeing the animals there, they decided against it. So, as we were leaving the park again, we seen more wildlife and seen Denali off in the back. It's a proven fact that only about 25% of the people who come to Denali National Park actually see Mount McKinley, and it makes its own weather. And we took the tour bus again, and there in the distance is McKinley, and seen caribou along the road, and ptarmigan, and moose, and there was a caribou walking in the drainage. You see there's no water in it at that point. It was early in the morning, and the snow was not melted, so there was no water in those glacier streams at that point. And we were headed back on this tour, headed up into Denali National Park. Seen a grizzly bear up on the hill, and some other moose and caribou down in the flats down there. And we're ultimately headed down to the interior, down to Anchorage, and stopped and inspected these little curio shops along the road, and we wanted to go see one of the old gold mining dredges which they used back in the early times when gold was $35 an ounce. They had to give it up because it was costing too much to run this stuff. And down along the Yukon River there, and we hiked back in there. Beautiful country all the way through there. And we were headed around through the Chugach Mountains, and that was the mountains we were going to hunt Dall sheep in later on, and headed down to Valdez, where the pipeline terminates. And we were going to inspect that area along the trail. It's along there, Seven Falls. There was another one, Horseshoe Falls. Beautiful country, rugged. We had about 150 miles to go from Anchorage to Valdez, and all that country, beautiful country through there. Of course, every so often they had a little country store with a meat cache, and we camp along there along the side and got another picture of Denali off in the distance, and other falls along the road because we were going through the Chugach Mountains. This was called Horseshoe Falls. And we got down to the port of Valdez, where the pipeline terminates. Of course, it's a great fishing port. Went down and inspected the boats, walked around the waterfront, and actually seen some real nice salmon, fresh caught salmon that were in the boats had caught. So we rented a 6-place plane, and 5 of us went up and flew out of Valdez over the pipeline termination. You can see the tanks in the background where the big tankers come and pump the oil in it and out the passage there worldwide. And we flew up out of Valdez and up over the mountains there to the glacier. We were going to the Columbia Glacier, which is 3.5 miles across the face of it, 350 feet high, and it ran like 45 to 50 miles back into the country. And this is constantly moving down the mountains. The snowfall that falls in the wintertime pushes it off, and it calves off into the ocean. And we flew right out over the top of the thing. You could look right down on it and see the meltwater. And like I said, 45 miles back into the back country. You see the black strips on there. That's where it goes along a mountain, and the rocks that roll off the mountain are carried down the face of the glacier to the face of the glacier and calved into the ocean. Of course, all ice water, and got along the front of it there, and there were seals on the ice floes, and got nice and close to take a couple pictures of it. And back over to Valdez again, and Valdez had an earthquake a number of years ago, and they had to relocate the town, and one of the streams where salmon were running back at that time of the year up into the deal, and I actually caught one by hand. And of course we were headed again out of Valdez, came along the pipeline there. We could get right up close to it and see what was going on. There's a meat cache where they used to keep their frozen, that was their idea of an outdoor refrigerator. The girls had to take some pictures. And we were at Mount McKinley again in the background, down the road. We headed down to the Matanuska Valley, where it's a great vegetable growing area. They got real mild summertime and of course constant daylight, so stuff grows real profusely there, flowering kale, and we were always on the lookout for these gnarly tree knobs that we had, like they had on the cabins that we came by, and we found a couple and took them along home. Put them on top of the motor home and passed the Matanuska Glacier, and we were headed back to meet with Danny Watley, our outfitter. And this is where we went on the Dall sheep hunt. We flew out of Tulsana Lake and back up about 40 miles into the sheep camp, rugged country, and of course we didn't know really what to expect. We knew it was going to be rough, but we were in shape to do it, and we were young enough. Usually people don't go on these hunts until later in life, and they can't get around as well, so we were very fortunate. Of course, we came into Milo Creek, and they had two big drainages there, and they had a tent camp put up there, and we dropped in on a little gravel bar, and they were fixing up supper. Next morning we were up bright and early. Ernie on the left, and Hank and I, and another packer, Mike, he carried his pack to help us. And we were hunting. We would take food along for 4 days, hike back into this country, and wherever we happened to be that particular night, we'd unroll our bed and pack and set up tent, and that's where we were. And all the time glassing, trying to find sheep. And it was rugged country, all broken glacier rubble, and loose shale and ice. Crawling up a glacier deal to get up on the next top one up there. We had to stop for lunch, and usually we get water right out of the little glacier streams right there and put tang with it. Nice clean water. The old glacier running down there, we walked right over them. We were always roped together, Ernie taking the lead, and we came across some grizzly prints right in the snow, right up on top. And all the time glassing, trying to find our way, find some sheep. And we were working on a group of 6 of them, and there was a couple big rams in there, and couldn't get to them. Worked for 4 days, back to camp, headed back out again. The next day on more hunt, trying to get around this spline of mountains that we couldn't traverse from one side to another, but the sheep were on the top, and they'd drop, they'd see us, and they'd go over top on the other side. because sheep really have no natural enemies. They stay up high, and wolves, and that's where they're on a vantage point. But straight down area, you can see past Ernie there. We're on broken rubble there, trying to get around, and this was the 7th day I'm waiting in ambush, so to speak. I'd split away from the guys, and they went around the opposite side, and lo and behold, that was the way they were going to push them. If they wanted to go from one side to another, we thought we'd try to put the sneak on them, and we was waiting up on the top side there, all roped up together, and trying to get from one place to another. Turned out that we stopped for lunch often because we were hiking, the air was thinner and country was rugged, but we had beautiful weather. See all the glacier moraines there, they call them, and always glassing, looking for more sheep. That's Splina Mountains there. They would go over top of that, one on one side to the other side, and we couldn't get over there. Try as we might. We had another 3 days, and I finally got posted on this side on day 7, and Hank went up the other side, and he got a shot at it, broke that sheep's back foot, and he fell down between a crevice. As the glacier had moved away from the mountain, he fell down in between there, and they had to tie a rope on Ernie and let him down so he could retrieve this sheep. And it had a broken horn on the right side. It had broomed off, they call it, and of course the bigger the horn, the older, they don't grow them back. It was full curl on this side, but the other side was only about 8 inches long. Then it kind of dawned on me that we got back into camp that night, and we'd been hunting 8 days of a 10-day hunt, and I needed to get me a sheep, and we had been hunting with Hank and all the time, and we had drawn straws, and Hank had the first shot, so he stayed back at camp, and Ernie and I hiked out. He said, no problem, we'll go to Black Mountain. He said, there's sheep up there, and I've seen them before, and we'll go get you one. So we hiking through that country, and beautiful country again, and always glassing, looking for the sheep and the rams up on the mountain. And we get to Black Mountain, and of course it's just that, a black mountain with a like pushed up shale for 3/4 of a mile long. And we had to hike out there, and we couldn't get through there because there was a rushing stream to get to it. And Ernie said they had, after spotting the ewes and the lambs, we decided Ernie would go around the bottom, and I would crawl up the face of Black Mountain and go up to the top and get in position because he was going to chase those rams up to me. I thought, yeah, you bet. Here we go. I had 800 yards of uphill climbing, all loose shale, and there's Ernie whistling and singing down the bottom so that the rams would have attention to him. And sure enough, here he's down in there, and I noticed the 4 rams broke off and were headed up this side of Black Mountain, just like we figured. He said, make sure you take the one in the lead, he says, because that's usually the biggest one. So we waited, and there was no place to hide. The thing was all loose shale, so I got down behind a little rock, and here about 10-15 yards below me was a little sheep trail, and by golly, if them sheep weren't headed right up that trail straight towards where I was sitting. So I laid the rifle across I was just about standing up, but it was that steep, and laid it across my shoe, and when they came up right across below me, I put the thump on the big one down there, and he rolled off that mountain down the hill, and oh man, I thought, what a mess he's gonna make. He all bloodied up and the whole 9 yards. And turned out that from where I shot the sheep, it continued to roll off for sure 500 yards off that mountain, end over end. And I thought, oh man, it's messing it all up. When we got to it, it was bloody, the hairs are hollow. How are you ever gonna get this blood out of it? Ernie said not to worry, those guys have a way of fixing that up. So we were so exhausted, we just pitched the tent right there at that particular spot. It was late afternoon, we had a bite to eat, and laid out under the stars and camped out. Didn't even put a tent up, we were so tired. But Ernie said, keep a loaded gun next to you because we might need it because we got fresh blood on the ground and there is grizzlies in this area. So anyway, that night the aurora borealis were just like curtains above our location there. Absolutely stunning and beautiful. Next morning we woke up early and I said to Ernie, I said, give me a big smile. Nothing had bothered us during the night, so we got up and proceeded to have breakfast and take some pictures, and then we had a hike back to camp. Tell Danny what had happened and how we were doing, and which we did, and long back hike home, but it was very restful and very rewarding. We got back into camp and they took meticulous skinning the cape out so that we'd have a good picture, to show when we were done, good trophies to show. We took some pictures of Hank and myself with the trophies, and we were getting ready to leave camp, and Danny was going to fly us back to Tulsana Lake, and so the trophies turned out all right. We sent it to Jonas Brothers. I had Danny take it to Jonas Brothers in Anchorage, and they in turn shipped it to me about 6 months later, and it was beautiful on the wall. None of the blood showed up, but was on the cape to begin with, and we had a beautiful trophy when we were all done. Anyway, Danny flew us back out of that area, back to Tulsana Lake, out over the 40-some miles where we had come, where we had hiked down along the river, and back to Tulsana, and there was the motorhome setting. It was a very welcome sight. The girls had been out traveling with the motorhome. They put 1,000 miles on the motorhome while we were in sheep camp, and they did the Greywater deal and all of that. And of course we headed down the Alaskan Highway from Watson Lake. It isn't all blacktop at that point. We had to even go through the water over the road some spots. Got our motorhome pretty dirty. Brenna was helped clean up the back window so we could see where we were going. And the whole trip we never had a broken windshield or any issues at all, tire problems. Back through Alberta and Lethbridge and headed for home. And we were excited to be home and had a great trip, and stopped one last time along the interstate in South Dakota. The second trip to Alaska was to go on a moose, grizzly, black bear hunt with advice from Ernie. So Irma's parents came and stayed by our house with Brenna and Chris, who was in school now, so we decided to fly. So we left Sioux Falls on our way up to Anchorage. We flew Western Airlines out of Sioux Falls, had a good trip. Flew to San Francisco, which we changed planes, flew up through Seattle, Washington, and on over to Anchorage, Alaska. At which time we were met at Anchorage by Ernie Coleman, my guide who I had on the previous hunt, and they had graciously invited us to come to their house. She would pick us up at the airport, and Ernie would be in hunting camp guiding, and so we could drop Ernie's wife off, and she would fly to hunting camp, so we would have the use of their car and their house at that particular time, which made it real easy for us to get around and enjoy the country and look around. And then later on, after 10 days, Irma and I she would fly back home, and I would go on a 12-day grizzly moose hunt. That was the plan. So first thing I asked her was, how has the weather's been? And she says, oh, the weather's been pretty rainy the last 25 days. She said, I hope you have better weather. Well, turned out that we were there for 10 days with Irma and 12 days on the moose hunt, and we had a half a day of rain in that whole time. Weather was beautiful, ideal. So we drove her out to Tulsana Lake, where Danny came and picked her up and flew her into Moose Camp so she could be with her husband there. We met up with Bob Vogelaar and his niece, and he said, I'm flying out of Anchorage, and he said, I have a hotel room paid by the company, so why don't you stay at my hotel, and I'll be flying nights, so you can stay at our motel. So he took us over and showed his equipment there, even got to sit in the right seat of a big C-46 stretch plane, which he was flying at the time. Next day we went up to Turnagain Arm, seen the area there behind Anchorage where the tides fluctuate by 40 feet. So we got to see that, and then he was with us, and we were traveling up towards Denali National Park where he was camping, and he had a camper, so we stayed in that. We went on a tour of camp of Denali, seen grizzly bear walking right across the road in front of the bus and out in the bush. It made me all excited because that's what I was up there to hunt. Thought, man, this can't be a big deal. There they are right out like that, but I had a lot to learn at that point. So we went to the trip into the park and saw sheep and saw Mount McKinley and all its grandeur, and animals along the way, along the road, and saw McKinley both coming and going that day. It was beautiful. There was clear sky all the way around. Beautiful country. We got to the end of the lake, or not to Wander Lake. We couldn't get, the road was snowed in before then, so we could only get to there, and there were some kids playing there in the snow, but there's Mount McKinley in all its glory. So we drove back out of the park, and with Bob and his niece, we drove back to Anchorage, dropped them off again. He went to work, and we could stay at their motel. We went down to the Turnagain Arm and to Land's End there and had supper there. Showed us how do they clean Dungeness crabs. The little guy along the beach was busy clamming for clams. Irma walked out there up in the curio shop along the way. We had to stop and take it all in. And also saw a big freighter, like we drove up a cruise ship, but we took the Taku, and the year before went out on a Glacier Bay excursion out on the lake and see where they calved off into the ocean. Back in town or along the road there was salmon. Said, baby, I could catch one of them by hand if I tried real hard, and Irma got down there and she caught one. They were so thick in there. These are dog salmon. They use them for dog food up there to sustain their huskies, which they use in racing in that area. So we drove up to where the Tanana River meets and saw some beautiful country up in that area, along the Yukon River, falls along every place you'd stop was a picturesque place to look, and we were just killing some time traveling there through the country with Irma and I, and seeing the sights. We got to the Matanuska Valley down there, and of course we stopped and looked at his old trappers' cabins and the cache that they had, and the flowering kale and stuff. Beautiful. They really can grow vegetables in that area. Saw Mount McKinley again in the distance, and a Matanuska Glacier right outside of town, and all kinds of beautiful glaciers and stuff that we saw up in that country. Just touring around, looking, taking our time, going back to Anchorage and staying in Bob's motel or hotel that he had supplied by his company because he was flying nights. Other beautiful scenery, flowering kale again. Stopped, swung by where Ernie had, Coleman and his wife had built this cabin. They lived up there prior to them moving to Alaska. He was a dairy farmer from Pennsylvania. Him and his brother ran this dairy farm together, and he decided he wanted to take some time off to go to Alaska. So his brother said, I'd like to do the same. He was going to go on a service project to South America, so they took switches in ownership there and management of their dairy farm so that they could both do what they wanted to do. So when we were up there, we went to the Tanana River and we took a excursion there on the river where you could see where the people lived, and everybody's got it, or just about everybody's got their own little float plane. And you can see here where the glacier water mixes with the clear water, the glacier water being silty, carrying lots of stuff down. They had an island there where you could go, and they demonstrated and showed you how a fish wheel worked, where they collect salmon, take the meat out. They salvaged all the eggs, the roe out of it, but they put the meat up to dry for their dogs and for human consumption. The young lady there was showing us, explaining the different aspects of bush living, some of the interesting stuff they had. She explained all the time. The cabin they lived in the wintertime, this was a regular working cabin. They had dog teams out there, sled dogs tied up to their cabins up on the hill there. You could see them. Gorgeous country. People had built homes right along the river there, up in the tide. The water was eroding the banks there. There was always permafrost, so that it didn't erode very fast. You could see the sled dogs all up on top of their boxes there. Once again, everybody had an airplane, the way it seemed like. And this was a boat lift that they'd lift a big paddle wheeler out of the water if they had to do maintenance on it. And we were on the boat Discovery, just touring and looking around. Went back to the area where they used the dredges to mine gold back in the early 1900s. The Alaska pipeline came down. We were right there by it. See the fins up on top. They kept coolers that kept the permafrost frozen around the base of it. Traveled up back towards Fairbanks and Anchorage around that area. Saw Mount McKinley again in the background. Took another tour of Mount McKinley. Saw a moose right outside of the bus. The driver stopped, and I took the picture right outside of the bus door. He wouldn't allow anybody else to naturally step off the bus, but we saw eagles and moose and caribou down in the valley and all kinds of good stuff. Grizzlies right along the caribou again in Matanuska, and we got to the end of the trip, and Mount McKinley was in the background. There was a young lady playing in the snow there, making snow angels. That was the end. We then drove back down to Anchorage, and I brought back Irma to the airport to fly her home because I was going to go on a 12-day grizzly moose hunt. And I remember saying to her, things will be fine, you'll be home, and I'll give you a call when I get back in the airport after the hunt so that you'll know everything went well. And she flew home to then be with the kids, and her parents went back to Hull, and I drove down to Glen Ellen and Tosana Lake so that I could again join Ernie and his wife, who had flown out earlier. So on the way over to Tosana Lake, I thinking to myself, I had all my gear with me and everything. We had stayed by Ernie's house and his wife, and I drove their car back to Tosana Lake and met up with Danny, the guide. He flew us out over Tosana Lake and back out to the hunting camp, when basically the hunting camp was down about a mile from where we had hunted sheep 2 years earlier. That was up in the high country, and this was just in a little lower country, lower elevation, where you could shoot moose and grizzly. They were flying over the landing strip and coming in for a landing at Milo Creek, which is two big drainages that they had camps on. The one you had an airstrip, and the other one you could fly out of. There they just had a tent camp set up, and we roughed it there, ate good all the time, but no problems. Always on the lookout, always glassing for more sheep, or in this particular case we were looking for moose. And Ernie's wife was in camp, and the camp robbers there, little Jay, and he said, we got to do a little glassing. We get up on high on the mountain the next morning and glass into the valleys, and sure enough, their horns would stick out white at this time of the year. They had them rubbed down, and we proceeded to see 7 different bull moose, and we stalked down on this one. I wound up putting the thump on him, and he was a 57-inch spread moose, big, unbelievable tall at the shoulders, heavy. And I was coming down with a little bit of a flu or whatever at this particular point, and Ernie says, well, we'll get some berries here, some red berries, and we'll get you all fixed up. But they hung the meat up in the tree and what we couldn't carry back, and we headed back to camp. We were about 2.5 miles from camp, so we hauled moose meat and the horns back the first time, and the cape, and we had it back at camp. And Ernie's job was then to cape the flesh out of the moose cape, make sure that the lips were turned and the ears, and we salted it down good, because that way the fur don't slip and you ruin the trophy that you got. Big 57-inch moose, and took the moose meat, hung it underneath the thing. And here's another story. There's the other guy who was in camp with me. He was a stockbroker, Connie, from New York, and he was in camp, and he hired these guys to carry his gun and carry his pack. He only carried his own rifle, and he hunted there over the gut pile of some German hunters who had been into camp before time, but never did shoot a grizzly or a moose. He said, I'll take a black bear. He said, hell, they back in New York, they won't know the difference anyway. So we had to hike the next day to Milo Creek, and because there was another whole drainage there, we were now looking for black bear and grizzly, naturally. And they had a log cabin set up there with another little cabin, a sauna, which we were really looking forward to using. And Ernie's wife was there. She prepared some meals for us, and we slept in a bunk, and we lived like kings. Every day we were out hunting, and they had a little stream dammed up there with a pump on for water. And out behind camp, there was all buckbrush in the valley. And out behind camp that first morning, we were looking around glassing and seen Ernie thought it was a grizzly at first, but it turned out it was a cinnamon-colored black bear. Black bears in Alaska do not get very large, but this was a cinnamon one, and he was a very nice size. So we decided to put the sneak on him, and I got below him, Ernie got above him, and he threw some rocks into the brush. We was in a bunch of brush like this, and he spooked him out, and I took him on the run and got him. He squared 6.5 feet for a cinnamon black bear. Man, we were about 2.5 miles from camp at that time. Ernie was elated because they had not gotten a cinnamon black bear in that area, and the black bear, like I said, were smaller. This was a nice size one, beautiful markings. We skinned him all out, brought him back, toted him back to camp, and laid him out, stretched him out, turned the toes and lips and everything so that it would keep to make a good rug out of it. The next morning, Ernie and I took enough grub for 3 days and headed out up this valley. And the idea was, he said he had saw some grizzly sign up there, and they'd hunted up there in the past and seen grizzlies, so he said it'd be a good place to go. So we hiked up this valley and saw a female sow with her 2 cubs. She was digging out a marmot. They're kind of like a big woodchuck. And she moved a bunch of boulders and got him out of there and shared him with her kids. And so we continued to hike up to the top of this valley. It was about a 3-mile hike. And we got close to the top, and Ernie says, I think we'll stop for lunch here a minute. He proceeded to say that to sustain a sow and her cubs takes 10 square miles. So we covered a lot of area in the time that we were there, glassing, looking all directions for a sow, and they basically find carrion or other animals which they can catch, wounded or diseased, and they clean them up. So we stopped at just about at the top, 100, 200 yards from the top of this valley, and Ernie said we should stop and have a bite to eat, and then we'll go up to the head end of this valley. And while he was cooking lunch there, or preparing lunch, he said he scratched his pants and it made a rustling sound, and I spun around and I said, boy, it sounded strange to me. He says, well, it was just me scratching my pants. I said, okay, fine. So we put our stuff together and he hiked up to the top of this valley, and there was a knob ahead of us, and he said, I'll tell you what, I'll go around one side, you go around the other side. If you see anything, give me a shout and we'll go see what it is. So anyway, he left, and that was the only time that he was not with me. By law, he's supposed to be with me hunting as a guide. And so we split up, and I had just sitting down and laid the rifle across my knees and proceeded to glass across the valley, and I heard this noise behind me, and just like Ernie scratching his pants, I spun around, and here was this grizzly coming down directly at me. She was coming off the hill above us, and instinctively picked up the gun, and I had a shell in the chamber. I had just hiked and said, you know, this old Dutchman can take anything by himself, and hiked up, spun around and put a shot into her and rolled off to the side, and she was 4 feet from me, 3 to 4 feet from me, spinning around, but her attention was to herself because she had I hit her in the hump, and a slip of her intestine was hanging out, and that was on her side, and she was spinning around, biting at that and snarling at that, and I shot her again, and I shot her again as she spun down the hill, shot her 4 times, and she kept snarling and moving down, and I couldn't believe this was happening. And I looked back up where she had come from, and sure enough, there were 2 2-year-old cubs standing. One was standing up on his hind feet, and they were woofing, calling to their mother, woof, woof. And man, about this time, Ernie, who had hiked around the corner of that knob not 10 minutes before that, come running around the corner, and he says, what's going on? And I dropped my pack and got it between me and the bears, and walked up or ran around the hill to meet Ernie. And I said, well, I shot a bear. And he said, well, good. And I said, no, it was a sow with cubs. And oh man, he said, well, she's going to be around, or they're going to be around here, them cubs, because they were 2-year-old. They always den up with their mother for the 2 years, and they would have been on their own. And so we looked around that area and did not find any sign of them, and proceeded to scour through that area, but they were gone. They'd left after all the excitement. So we said, well, we got this knife out and put the skin and knife to them and skinned them out and took them back to camp. And you can see where I hit them in the hump, and it come out the side. And I said, well, what do they do with a nuisance kill like this, or an attack? She said, well, we'll have to fly into camp tomorrow and turn the bear hide in and let the Fish and Game decide what they're going to do. So we cleaned it all up and turned the lips and the ears and the toes just in case. I said, well, they can't take the experience away from me, or they can't take they can take the hide away, but I said, where else would you ever have a deal like this happen to you? So the next day we went into the Fish and Game in flew back to the road and drove back to Glen Ellen and got with the Fish and Game, and they took us each in a room and wanted to hear our stories separately of what happens, because this guy I told him exactly what happened. He says, you don't know how fortunate you are to come that close to a grizzly coming after you and get away without a scratch. He says, you're very fortunate. And he said, I'll tell you why. He says there was a hunter and a pilot were flying with a plane, which is illegal in Alaska. You can't fly and hunt in the same day. But they seen a grizzly on a moose carcass, so they stopped, flew, found a gravel bar, landed in. The hunter went in to shoot the bear, and he didn't come back, and the pilot didn't hear any sounds or anything, so he hiked in there partial way and found this hunter. He'd got mauled by this grizzly, got killed, and he came back out and flew back to town, told the Fish and Game what they were doing, and they flew in there, shot the grizzly, and recovered the hunter. He had indeed got mauled by this grizzly. And there were 2 German hunters that had done the same thing. The pilot had dropped them off, and they were going to go in there, and the bear turned around and got them both, killed them both. And he said, now here you're telling me you get away without a scratch, being that close to a bear? He said, it just doesn't happen. But he said, I understand what happened, so here's your license back, and you can continue to look for a bear and see what you can find out. So anyway, we did. We flew back to camp, and we couldn't hunt that day naturally, but the next day we were out glassing again, because this was the 6th day of a 12-day moose hunt, or grizzly moose hunt. And I boiled out they put the sauna, warmed it up, and lit some fire under a bucket, and we boiled the head out, the skull of the black bear that I had got. So that's what I did on that particular day. But then we kept on hunting, and we did not ever come across a single bear that we could take on our license. So I went home with a grizzly tag in my pocket. And Ernie said, I'm going to hike out to the road. He said, I'd never shot a grizzly of myself yet. It was a 40-mile hike to the road, and he said, I'll have my wife meet me at a certain spot, a certain mile post, and he said, I'll hunt out. You never know, I might not get back, were his parting words. And he indeed did never get back. That when I got home, later on, I called his wife to see how they had gotten home, and she said, oh, he got home and he was going to the doctor, and the doctor said he was full of cancer, and he wound up dying that following February. So I was the last hunter that I ever hunted with, and Danny flew me back to Glen Ellen and said goodbye, and I said, well, you better keep track of this grizzly hide, and this, which we turned into the Fish and Game, and I said, you never know, we might get a chance that they auction that stuff off, and usually at the February Fur Rendezvous when there's lots of buyers in town. But the following February came and went, and never hear anything, and the following year, a year later, in the middle of hunting season, they decided they were going to sell this bear hide and the skull and some other used stuff. So I told Danny called me and he said, what do you want to do? And I said, well, I want to buy it back. It's just whatever. So when I hung up, I decided I'd given him a blank check. But anyway, he wound up, the next day he called me back and he said, I put the first bid in for $50 and I wound up buying it back. And he cost me $75 to get it shipped home. But anyway, so I had the bear hide, and when we moved to Michigan, I made it into a rug and put it on the wall. So I have those experiences, and I have the hide. We flew back to Anchorage, and the kids welcomed to be back home, and they had a sign put up on the deal and on the garage, welcome back, Dad. So it was really good to be home again.